Slavery or Freedom, our week-long online conference about the 1619 Project, its relationship to history and public policy, sponsored by the National Association of Scholars, the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, and the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Now, we are delighted this Thursday morning to have as our speaker on what makes American slavery distinctive, or unique, Robert L. Paquette, who is a prize-winning historian who has published extensively on the history of slavery in the Americas. He received his PhD in history with honors from the University of Rochester in 1982. In 2007, he co-founded the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization in Clinton, New York. In 2014, the Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation and the American Conservative Union Foundation awarded him the Jean Jordan Kirkpatrick Prize for Academic Freedom. His quite extensive list of books includes the Oxford Handbook of Slavery in the Americas in 2010, and I know he has, among other things, another book coming up soon, which I'm blanking on the title immediately, but he should tell everybody about it so that they could all rush out to buy it. Before I let him speak, I'll just mention, this is the bit where he speaks for, perhaps half an hour or so. There will then be a question and answer period where some questions from me, ideally as many questions as possible from the audience, please put them either in the chat or the Q&A buttons at the bottom of the Zoom session, or send email to me at randall@nas.org or to contact@nas.org. So we will try to get as many questions as possible for wonderful back and forth with Professor Paquette. Professor Paquette.
Well, first, I'm glad to be here. And I want to thank you, David, and the National Association of Scholars for organizing this event. It's a very special day for the Alexander Hamilton Institute. In fact, it's kind of, we've hit the trifecta. Not only is it Constitution Day, but it is the 13th birthday of the Alexander Hamilton Institute. And it's also the 90th birthday of Carl Menges, who has been one of our most important benefactors, serves on the board. So Carl, if you're in the audience, I hope you are. Happy birthday, you're a great man, and we could not have done it without you. Before I get into my discussion of slavery, I want to give a quote that I think is appropriate for Constitution Day. It has an interesting history. The quote is from a man by the name of Theodore Draper, who had a very interesting intellectual trajectory from left to right. And he published this in the New York Times. I don't know if he could publish this quote favorably in the New York Times anymore, but in 1993, he published a piece called "The Constitution Was Made, Not Born." And this is what he had to say. "The founders had no polls to tell them what to think, or speechwriters to put it into advertising prose for them. They did not know about lobbyists and political action committees. The debaters on the Constitution had to think for themselves and stand up for what they believe, not simply regurgitating slogans that would get them elected the next time around. They possessed an intellectual equipment and political commitment that puts their contemporary successors in Congress or the executive branch to shame. The men who took part in the making of the Constitution knew that they were present at an exceptional moment of creation, which called on them to give it their most serious and responsible thought and action. If ever the term best and brightest was appropriate to describe the nation's leaders, it was then." It's a quote that the AHI believes in and that I believe in, and I think it accurately captures what happened in 1776 and 1787. All right, what am I going to do today? Basically, my comments are going to provide a larger context for understanding the history of slavery. I'm also going to try to provide some workable definitions, which may help us clear up some of the terminological and conceptual muddle that I think the 1619 project has helped perpetrate. And then I will end my discussion with a few comments about the 1619 project. So here we go first with discussing the larger historical context. In a polemical response to Edmund Burke's great book, Reflections on the Revolution of France, Thomas Paine declared that it was an unspeakable violation of the natural rights of man that one person should be owned as the property of another. In the antebellum United States, abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison seized on the point and banged it like a sledgehammer as part of a broadening indictment of the antebellum South and its slaveholding planters. Looking around the globe for most of human history, eyes less partisan than Garrison's and less rationalist than Paine's, but more particularist and historical like Burke's, might well have concluded, however, that the condition most natural to man was dependency, not personal freedom. Throughout much of history, on every habitable continent, to be human meant to be dependent on the wills of others. Contrary to the abolitionists, human beings had owned other human beings long before positive law emerged to regulate the practice. Hence, Burke was thoroughly justified in glorying in a discrete tradition that had yielded the precious liberties, and I emphasize plural, of Englishmen. In medieval England, slavery had proved to be widespread. Slaves in some counties numbered perhaps 20% of the total population. After the Norman conquest, however, slavery declined for reasons that remain fuzzy. Yet serfdom and other extreme forms of bondage survived even as the common law frowned on slavery. Early modern English thinkers had difficulties in drawing precise distinctions between various forms of extreme dependency, in reconciling ideals with practice, in justifying who and under what conditions others become suitable for enslavement. In short, because of their love of English liberties, they had trouble crossing a perceptual threshold already crossed generations before by the Spanish and the Portuguese. Cultures in history and around the world today have never agreed on the meaning of ownership. Property shared the same root as proper. It applied to established social orders and implied legally enforceable claims between persons with respect to things. Property takes different forms. Things can be owned by states, by corporations, and by individuals. John Locke, arguably the last major Western European thinker to justify slavery, declared in the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, 1669, that masters had, quote, absolute power and authority, unquote, over their slaves. Indeed, in the second treatise, Locke noted under the category of servants a peculiar one called slaves, who by, quote, the right of nature are subjected to the absolute dominion and arbitrary power of their masters, unquote. Locke never denied, however, that a civil society could regulate by positive law that which existed in the state of nature, where, as Thomas Hobbes stated, the natural right of every man to everything endureth. Thus, because of mine and thine questions, every society in history had to enter into deliberations about the nature of what is just and how to construct rules of law to effect demarcations perceived to be just. Accordingly, all pre-modern lawgivers sought to manage the problem of private violence. They bestowed property in the form of privileges on certain groups to aid them in that task. Resulting status-laden hierarchies influenced how rulers rendered and restored to each person that which was properly his own. With servility and dependence prominent in every human community, ownership of human beings entailed dominion exercised by one person to greater or lesser degrees over another. If authorities validated a person's bundled claims, legally enforceable claims, which included the right to exclude others from the use of the property, to also alienate it, rent it, or configure it virtually at will, then the form of property, including human property, merited the adjective private. When one enslaves another, it implies not merely the ownership of human beings, but the private ownership of human beings. Regulation implies that the state has withdrawn from the private owner certain sticks in the bundle of property rights, legally enforceable claims that confer degrees of dominion. Labor, of course, is a crucial factor of production. The value of owning labor privately helps explain why slavery has existed in a variety of historical contexts. In some cases, slavery underpins civilizations. In others, it survived at or near the margin of society, one labor form among many. The oldest religious texts, the Talmud, the Bible, the Quran, reference slavery. Indeed, all the world's great religions, I repeat, all the world's great religions gave the institution at one time or another authoritative approval. The Quakers have pride of place as the world's first religious denomination to come out systematically against slavery, to say that enslavement was a condition wrong for anyone, anywhere. Slavery had appeared natural to man because violence appeared natural to man. Here's Voltaire. All animals are perpetually at war, Voltaire said. Every species is born to devour another. War served as history's most outstanding means of mass enslavement. Reflections on the nature of war help direct the intellectual and legal scaffolding that surrounded and supported slavery's institutionalization. In no way, from a global perspective, did the Old South's peculiar institution look peculiar in the sense of being uncommon. Indeed, one of the striking facts about slavery in world history is not its peculiarity in the sense of being uncommon, but its ubiquitousness. The far more recent, far more peculiar institution is free or wage labor, where labor is left to contract and consent. Please take my word on this. Columbus did not bring slavery to the Americas, period. In subjugating others by violence into extreme forms of bondage, peoples in Africa and the Americas needed no instruction from the French, the Spanish, the English, or other Western Europeans. Slave trades of striking magnitude had preceded Columbus in the Mediterranean Sea, in the Indian Ocean, and within Africa itself. In 1492, Africa probably had more slaves than any other continent. From the time of Muhammad to the 20th century, sub-Saharan Africa channeled millions of slaves into the Islamic world. Evidence of slavery in pre-Columbian society abounds, not only in the densely populated urban centers located in the Andean highlands in central Mexico, but in many smaller chiefdoms throughout the Americas as well. The largest slave rebellion in history, from the time of Spartacus to that of the Haitian Revolution, broke out in the 9th century AD near what is today southern Iraq. thousands and thousands of zanj, a pejorative word I might add, slaves of East African origin who had been imported in the area and were laboring in agricultural projects, erupted and created a state that lasted 14 years against the best efforts of the Abbasid Caliphate to crush it. Although Columbus ventured at least once to West Africa before 1492, the African slave trade held no vital interest to him. Whatever the net balance of his demonstrable sins, when weighed against his remarkable achievements, his enterprise of the Indies expanded the world and brought 4 continents together into sustained contact. Over time, out of the endless groping of those who followed him, their hit and miss initiatives of knowledge gained by stumbling and bumbling around in the dark of uncharted places, emerged the design of an orderly system of transatlantic commerce. Its trade-offs brought enormous and undeniable benefits to the world's peoples, along with immense human suffering. Who won and who lost, however, defies any simple calculus. For most of the 4th century history of the Atlantic slave trade, European slave traders confined themselves in coastal trading posts located on the shoreline in 7 major slave trading zones. And let me add, they didn't really move off the coast until the late 19th century. They stayed on the coast because of epidemic disease and because also in Africa, there were some very powerful states and empires with which they had to contend. Traders depended on African suppliers, and despite preferences for certain ethnic groups over others, generally purchased what was supplied to them. Captains preferred one-stop shopping, load quickly, and get the hell out of an environment that was quite deadly to white crewmen. West Central Africa, the zone that produced colonial Jamestown's first servants or slaves, furnished more slaves for transport to the Americas than any other zone during the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th. Very easy to remember. For all those centuries, the #1 trading zone was West Central Africa. According to the prime mover of the 1619 project, quote, a Portuguese slave ship had forcibly taken, unquote, the slaves who ended up in Jamestown, quote, from what is now the country of Angola, unquote. Now let us be correct here. A slave ship did not steal. Traders purchased from other traders, captives most likely taken as prisoner as a result of an internal war. In 1619, there was a hell of an internal war going on in West Central Africa. It pitted Congos, a ferocious cannibalistic warrior group known as the Imbengala, dissident Ndongo nobles, and the Portuguese together against the kingdom of Ndongo. In 1776, Great Britain had 26 colonies in the Americas, 13 on the North American mainland. Although the common law of England frowned on slavery, all 26 of Britain's American colonies permitted legal slavery. When the 13 rebellious colonies severed their ties with Great Britain, they did so with heads of households who numbered among the freest and most prosperous people on the planet. They revolted not against an existing tyranny, but against an apprehended one. Most did not believe in abstract equality, but rather equality before God and equality under the law. They valued the rights of Englishmen and rooted their capacity to defend those rights in the freehold, that is, the private ownership of land. and in their representative bodies, which were edging towards sovereignty and had a property requirement for entrance. The founders knew enough about the outside world to recognize how easily a group, class, race, or nation could slide into political servility, if not chattel slavery. The founders of this country could take great pride in their accomplishments precisely because they knew that most of the inhabitants of the world lived in abject misery in one form of servility or another. If someone had pulled aside a representative common person on any continent in 1776 and asked, quote, "What do you think about slavery?" unquote, the respondent might well have retorted in his native tongue, after reflection on his own dependent condition, "Slavery? It has existed and always will exist." Although more than 30 of the 55 framers of the Constitution owned slaves, most hoped the institution would wither on the vine. They saw slavery not as a positive good, but as a temporary expedient or a necessary evil. Exactly how emancipation would occur, they could not precisely say, but most agreed it needed to end gradually and that the matter would be left largely to the decision-making of sovereign states. Widespread sentiment existed north and south that the Atlantic slave trade to the United States had to end. Most states of the United States had moved to end it before 1808, the year when the Constitution, under Article 1, Section 9, permitted federal legislation against it. And it's very important to underscore that Article 1, Section 9 did not ban the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade in 1808. In fact, it put a ban on a ban until 1808. That is to say that they could think about banning it in 1808. And it's a credit to President Thomas Jefferson, an anti-slavery slave owner, that he moved expeditiously to end the Atlantic slave trade with the help of friends in Congress at the soonest possible date. His administration and his allies in Congress wasted no time in acting to prohibit the external slave trade as quickly as they could. And few, and I'll underscore this, contraband slaves arrived in the United States after 1808. And we have substantial quantitative and qualitative evidence to point that out. None of the first 13 states in the United States, according to the federal census in 1790, had a majority of slaves within their boundaries. The census counted no slaves in Massachusetts. New York, with 20,000 slaves or so, had more slaves than all the other northern states combined, amounting to 6% of the state's total population. The proportion of slaves in the 6 southern states ranged from a low of 15% in Delaware to a high of 43% in South Carolina. Unlike colonial Caribbean sugar colonies, no southern state ever counted slaves as a supermajority in the total population, although, to be sure, high slave densities could be found in certain subregions like Lowcountry South Carolina or Lower Louisiana. A useful, and I bring this up because Peter Koklanus mentioned this, and I want to bring some clarity to an important point he made yesterday. A useful, if grayish, analytical line can be drawn between societies with slaves and slave societies. In history, the former far outnumbered the latter. In 1776, Massachusetts was a society with very few slaves. South Carolina was a slave society. Drawing the line hinges not on a proportional threshold, however suggestive that might be, but on what roles slaves filled and what functions they performed. Whether, for example, those who enjoyed high status and predominant power in the society derived them from their ownership of slaves. The Ming Dynasty might have ruled as a slave society because its rulers were undergirded by tens of thousands of eunuchs, all slaves. The Ottoman Empire might qualify because the spearhead of its armies were the Janissaries, slave soldiers derived from tribute paid in male children extracted from Christian households in the Balkans. In 1776, the United States consisted of 7 northern societies with slaves and 6 northern slave societies. More than 10 million enslaved Africans arrived in the Western Hemisphere during the entire 4th-century history of the Atlantic slave trade. Their legal enslavement extended from Canada to Cape Horn. Imports peaked at about 100,000 annually when Saint-Domingue, a French colony, now known as Haiti, was reaching its height as a plantation colony in the 3rd quarter of the 18th century. I might interject here that Saint-Domingue, or what is today Haiti, in 1790 had more slaves than Virginia, Georgia, and South Carolina combined. Not until near the midpoint of the 19th century did the total number of European migrants to the Americas exceed the total number of imported African slaves. Today, because of the monumental work of a team of scholars led by David Eltis, an old friend of mine and former graduate school colleague, historians, now listen to this, now know more about the quantitative history of the Atlantic slave trade than they know about the quantitative history of European migration to the Americas. By the way, this information is readily available in a database that is easily accessible online. If you want to look at it, just Google in these words, slave voyages, and you will be taken there. And it's wonderful to play around with. The majority of African slaves ended up on highly commercialized units of agriculture in Brazil and the Caribbean, producing commodities for export. Less than 4%, I underscore this, less than 4% of the 10 million imports disembarked in the United States or the colonies that became the United States. More than 10% landed in the French Caribbean. More than 46%, almost half of all the African slaves imported into the Americas landed in Brazil. The tiny island of Barbados, easternmost island in the Caribbean, imported more slaves directly from Africa than did the United States or what became the United States. Cuba imported more enslaved Africans in a 50-year period from 1800 to 1850 than did the United States during its entire colonial and national history. The French colony of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, imported more slaves in 1 year. They imported 40,000 in 1790 than did Louisiana in its entire history under French, Spanish, and United States rule. The importation of millions of Africans into Western European colonies in the Americas engendered ambiguities that legal formulations attempted to clarify. Overall, slave codes, and this word codes, a marker of a slave society, express similar concerns, but a host of particular differences. Authorities look to set standards for masters in their treatment of slaves, as well as to regulate slave behavior. The prescriptive wisdom derived from the experience of masters and slaves living and working together informs slave codes. The driving force behind slave codes might come from the bottom up, from the slaveholders themselves who crafted the law, or it could come from the top down, with non-slaveholding metropolitan officials enacting law from afar out of enlightened self-interest to secure valuable colonies against the disruptive effect of masters abusing their dominion over slaves. Whether authorities were willing to enforce a slave code or only certain provisions of it remained an open question throughout the history of slavery in the Americas. No serious student of the history of slavery, however, would think to gauge the treatment of slaves and the status of race relations in any American slave society by equating the letter of the law to its enforcement. Informal social practice, embedded as custom and habit, often trumped existing regulations when they were not preparing the way for new or additional legislation. Wherever slavery existed, masters yielded much of their considerable power over their slaves well beyond the cognizance of the state. Plato had imagined a perfect slave, one who was a mere extension of his master's will. Aristotle famously described slaves as living tools. But no master who ever lived, whatever the boundaries of his imagination, could reduce the will of his slave to nothingness, to turn him or her into Plato's ideal of absolute obedience without destroying the desired object of his mastery. At ground level, history afforded plentiful examples of slaves acting on their own, naked will, to counter the master's force. More typically, a dynamic of resistance and accommodation played out within a complex of ever-changing circumstances. This dynamic inhered in the relation and over time qualified the terms of bondage. Masters with the pride and dominion and the monopoly of force on their side had to settle for the possible, their slaves' acceptable performance rather than the will o' the wisp of absolute dominion. Nor could any master or class of masters translate their power over slaves into authority to elicit the desired behavior by habit rather than force without the recognition in slaves of an independent will capable of giving consent. On this point, Michael Oakeshott, one of the 20th century's most important political philosophers, has left us some timeless wisdom that applies to more than the master-slave relation, but to other relations as well. And here it is, and I quote, "To bind another self to one's desires calls for exceptional skill. Force or peremptory command may in some circumstances suffice to convert another self to my purposes. But this will rarely be the most certain or the most economical manner of achieving my ends. It will more often happen that failure is avoided only by an acknowledgement of the subjectivity of the other self, which involves taking into alliance what refuses to be treated as a slave. That is, by offering a quid pro quo, which is itself a recognition of subjectivity," unquote. Contra the 1619 Project, Southern slaveholders in general did not deny their slaves humanity. Indeed, Southern theologians, strictly interpreting their Bibles, denounced attempts by outside racist pseudoscientists to redefine the one creation into two or more. A wide variety of influences shaped the lives of slaves throughout the Americas. The cultivation of some crops proved far more exacting than others. On the scale of less taxing to most, cotton cultivation stood out at one end of the spectrum, and sugarcane cultivation at the other. Only one subregion in the United States, Lower Louisiana, produced a significant amount of sugar, whereas plantations with hundreds of slaves proved common in places like Cuba, Brazil, Jamaica. The typical slaveholding unit in the southern United States held 10 slaves or less. Only a minority of adult white males in the United States owned slaves. In the South, that percentage had shrunk from about 1/3 in 1850 to about 1/4 in 1860. In 1830, more than 3,600 free persons of color in the Southern United uprising in the history of the United States in 1811 in the territory of Orleans was put down to a great extent with the help of propertied, slaveholding, free persons of color, a story that you will not see told in the 1619 Project. Planter absenteeism plagued slaveholding estates in the Caribbean. Masters in the southern United States tended to reside near where they planted. Unlike Brazil or Cuba in 1850, the southern United States had an overwhelmingly Creole, that is, native-born population. Sex ratios of slaves in southern states tended towards equality. In the southern United States, slaves had a rate of natural increase unmatched by any major slave society in history. To say, as the 1619 Project did, that the 13th colony, quote, struggled under a brutal system of slavery, unlike anything that had existed in the world before, unquote, is demonstrable nonsense, given what we know about the history of servile populations, such as Russian serfs, Chinese peasants, medieval thralls, and Caribbean slaves. Although, and this is important, get this, although Brazil imported almost 5 million African slaves, by 1860, its total population fell short of that in the United States, which had imported fewer than 400,000. Surely the ability of a population to grow and multiply naturally has to factor in to questions of treatment. In discussing the history of slavery in the United States, the New York Times 1619 Project implies that it is disclosing vital information that either has been hidden from the public or not given due weight by the educational establishment. To understand the outlandishness of such a claim, please understand that the last half century has witnessed nothing less than an avalanche of scholarship on slavery. Its study has spread out to include analyses big and small from almost every conceivable perspective, which overlap with every humanistic and social scientific discipline. The study of slavery has served as a cutting edge to examine major questions within disciplines and as a creative way to re-examine transcendent questions about the human condition itself. The Times launched the 1619 Project in a special 100-page section of the Sunday magazine little more than a year ago. Nicole Hannah-Jones, the project's prime mover, pronounced the goal of this multi-stage enterprise as nothing less than exposing what she calls the hypocrisy of the American founding and the shamefulness of all American history. Whether the New York Times ever intended to have a serious conversation about the history of race and slavery in the formation of our great experiment in Republican government remains open to doubt. Indeed, when the 1619 Project arrived, it came replete with the announcement that a well-heeled nonprofit called the Pulitzer Center, with access to millions of dollars, an organization that, quote, supports journalists, stories, and workplaces that represent and illuminate diversity and inclusion in all its forms, unquote, had already entered into a partnership with the New York Times to insinuate the 1619 Project into American school systems. Before publication, the 1619 Project had already embraced a grand design of distribution. The project seeks nothing less than to replace the alleged mythologies of existing narratives of American history with what Nicole Hannah-Jones calls the grandeur, her word, of a superior narrative, one that includes those who have supposedly been left out of the past. Don't be fooled. The 1619 Project is not about enriching the citizenry's understanding of the past. Rather, it is the attempted imposition on the citizenry, with the backing of powerful media and corporate allies, of a daring innovation by which American history is to be re-examined through a distorting lens of ideology, critical race theory to be exact, to advance a troublesome political agenda. Now, what is ideology? And we must resist whenever it is stated that we are all ideological. That is one of the most insidious generalizations that I hear in higher education these days. We are not all ideological, far from it. An ideology does not depend on fact. It does not pursue the truth. It substitutes for the complexity of a reality, for the complexity of reality, a prettified abridgment of it, so that the naive or unknowing, once shepherded into the flock, can take a desired position on a subject they themselves have not analyzed. Indeed, the most potent ideologies are the ones that most effectively insulate themselves from criticism, like activist A rebuffing the undermining evidence posited by scholar B by dismissing it as hate speech. I once asked the current president of Hamilton College, who had surfaced to pronounce loudly and publicly that his college would not tolerate hate speech. Where would he draw the line, I asked him, between hate speech and critical speech? He never answered me. I guess it's like pornography. You know it when you see it. For the 1619 Project, Ms. Hannah-Jones, the project's prime mover, recruited more than 30 contributors to the cause of historical deconstruction and reconstruction. Yet curiously, in a work that attempts to reframe the entirety of United States history, only 4 of 34 contributors to the special section of the New York Times qualify as professional historians. The number of journalists doubles the number of historians. The total of poets and writers of fiction exceeds that of the journalists. One result, the history presented throughout the 1619 Project smacks of undue present-mindedness, of judgments made without a deep understanding of historical context, and against standards the founders and other historical actors, given the limits of their intellectual and moral horizons, could not possibly have had. One might imagine, in a flight of fancy, a world of absolute freedom or perfect equality, but to use utopian or impossible standards to judge people of the past is a formula not only for bad history, but for perpetual revolution. Cicero, probably not one of the thinkers favored by the contributors to the 1619 Project, insisted that, quote, every systematic development of any subject ought to begin with a definition so that everyone may understand what the discussion is about. Damn good advice, I think. Unhappily, the prime movers behind the 1619 Project have paid no heed to it. In fewer than 100 pages, they have pronounced extravagantly and grandiosely about the history of slavery in the United States, yet they have done so with little regard to context, with meager and mystifying sourcing, and with almost studied failure to define keywords and concepts. Take, for example, the 5,000-word essay, one of the longest in the compilation, by the left-wing sociologist Matthew Desmond, who, by the way, is no expert on the history of slavery. Yesterday, Peter Colonies, by the way, did an excellent demolition of Desmond's work. But remember that Desmond wants us to understand, quote, the brutality of American capitalism, that it began with slaves on the plantation. Desmond speaks of a low road to capitalism and a high road to capitalism. And I guess because he was in Scotland before me, he decided that we all understood from the get-go precisely what the hell he meant by that overused and much abused word called capitalism. There are major thinkers on the left, Karl Marx for one, and on the right, Joseph Schumpeter, who in defining capitalism would deny slave-based plantations as ground zero. Marx rooted capitalism in a particular social relation of production, that between a wage earner and his employer, not between a master and a slave. Schumpeter defined capitalism as a system in which, and here's this key word, the non-personal means of production was owned privately. Personal means of production would be labor. Owning labor privately is slavery. Yeah. Now, some Austrian school economists would like to jettison the word capitalism itself from our vocabulary because a market economy is so messy, they say, that it can never be called a system. The text of the 1619 Project, peppered with no shortage of sentiment and wild speculation in the absence of hard evidence, also contains no few errors of fact. A few of the howlers include that by 1776, the emergence of a burgeoning British abolition movement incited colonists to rise in revolution to protect their slave property. Nonsense. Or that the first decades of the 1800s witnessed the height, I repeat, the height of the transatlantic cotton trade. It begins in the early decades of the cotton trade, that is, of the 19th century. Another mistake. The largest slave insurrection in US history, quote, has been virtually redacted from the historical record. Not true. In fact, I've actually written about it in previous articles. Or that for South Carolina's John Calhoun, there was no union per se. In the weeks and months ahead, expect a more sustained assault on the claims of the 1619 Project. Our own Peter Wood has an outstanding volume, 1620, The True Beginning of the American Republic, coming out in November. I've had the pleasure of reading it in manuscript. The Alexander Hamilton Institute's Mary Graybar has recently signed a contract with Regnery to produce a volume that centers on debunking the 1619 Project. Previously, as some of you may recall, with Regnery, Dr. Graybar published a best-selling volume, Debunking Howard Zinn, exposing the fake history that turned a generation against America. And as she has already noted in several published articles, the 1619 Project owes a considerable debt to Howard Zinn's insidious A People's History of the United States. Enough said. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. Sorry, I'm getting my video back on. Thank you. That was a lovely speech. And so I'm going to remind people, please send in questions and comments to the chat or Q&A buttons at the bottom. And I guess I'm going to start out with, well, a question I've been repeating to a number of people, that is how to translate this into teaching. That is, and this is actually, I mean, when you are teaching American history, you then sort of, in fact, have to go the extra step to say, here is why the context matters. But how do you translate that into high school teaching and I guess introductory college teaching, what is the precise way you put this in? And I guess also, and with the sense that a lot of people are going to come in sort of skeptical and hostile and unwilling to believe this, already.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties is the discipline of history itself. There's a joke that I've told to my students in the past. One of the Einsteins of his generation, a fellow who's still alive, is a physicist by the name of Edward Witten. And I always tell the story, do you know what his undergraduate major was? And people would say, well, probably physics or mathematics. I said, no, it was history. And I said, he left history, and this is probably apocryphal, he left history because he found it too difficult. The problem is, in teaching history to younger minds, it is difficult to convey the complexity of history. So there are a couple of things I would emphasize. One, that when you're dealing with history, you must be absolutely sure to have a firm foundation by defining keywords and concepts. Not necessarily saying that they are the be all or end all, but as Cicero pointed out, and Hobbes did the same thing, so that we know what we are talking about. Let's be clear how I understand these terms. You may understand them differently, but it is a beginning, not an end. And the other thing is, of course, the context. Historians, and you're one, David, it's a platitude. There can be no meaning without context. Well, history is a discipline which forces you to get into the rabbit holes, to gather information. And what you have to teach students is that there is a very difficult process of patterning that information, those facts, into a meaningful pattern with explanatory power. And that's the key, explanatory power. Because what we have too often today is that, it just kind of a Whig interpretation. Let's go back in the past and find whatever we want to argue against or whatever makes us feel good and move it forward. That is not good history. That does not allow you to make good judgments. You can't judge peoples of the past, as I said in my presentation, by a moral and intellectual horizon they could not possibly have had. So when we discuss slavery, I think it's absolutely crucial that people understand it in comparative context, that it's not just slavery, but servitude was everywhere. And that, of course, makes the American Republic, in many ways so distinctive, is there was this liberty, and granted at the beginning, it attached to white male heads of households for the most part, but nowhere else on the planet did you have such a high proportion of those householders participating in the polity. Because on every continent, you had rulers who lived off the servitude, the coerced labor, and that was taken as a given. What's new under the sun is the belief, which we see, emerging in the 18th and 19th century, that you did not have to explicitly coerce people to get the job you wanted done.
So I guess it's a follow-up question then on the teaching. I mean, this is actually fascinating just for both you and Peter Koklanis, the depth to which you need to know economic thought. And you are emphasizing, among other things, the Austrian economic school. And I guess it seems to me that to learn how to think economically is a very different skill and frame of mind from thinking historically. But in fact, to understand slavery, do you therefore need to know both history and economics and both modes of thought?
Yeah, well, I think certainly it helps. But remember, is that the discipline of economics is relatively modern, right? The economic, if we trace it back to Aristotle's understanding, it referred to the management of a household, which he could not easily imagine without slaves, all right? So, but obviously, what has happened with our studies is that has been broken up into disciplines and now all sorts of very fashionable programming. And one of the greatest sins of our time is the failure of liberal arts institutions, some of the very best that we have, to teach the liberal arts. Let me give you an example how bad this is. I dare you to find among any NESCAC school, the Little Ivies, Amherst, Middlebury, any of them, who mandate, not just for the undergraduates, but for history majors, at least a 2-sequence course in American history. Now think about that. We are training historians, and American history in the United States is disregarded, marginalized, in some cases even eliminated. I don't think they have that problem studying Chinese history in China. So I think this is something we need to think about, is that one of the things about a liberal arts education, which applies to history, is that properly done, it teaches us different approaches to the acquisition of knowledge. Right? There's a mathematical understanding, a philosophical understanding, an economic understanding. To be at our best, we need to know something about all of those ways of knowing. So that's what I'm saying. So that makes it difficult. Some people think, oh, history's so easy. Let me tell you, it is not easy if done properly. My most recent book, which I co-authored with Doug Edgerton, we spent more than a dozen years putting the information together to produce something that we think is definitive.
I'm going to have a somewhat different focused question from the audience. Earlier, you spoke about the slavery in Africa. Was slavery a market in Africa? And who was, and then who was selling the African, other Africans, white people living in Africa?
Right.
And is there any known country that didn't use slaves ever in their history?
Well, understand this, because the discipline of economics in many ways is a Western creation. So although we can analytically go back into Africa and see an economic, it's often very difficult to unravel the political from the economic in what Africans were doing. Now, that said, I can say without question is that the existence of Western European traders on the West African coast did incentivize the capturing of slaves and their sale. Remember that the Atlantic slave trade is only one leg of a multi-leg process. And that included, of course, from their taking slaves from point of catchment back to barracoons, slave trading depots, and then waiting for the arrival of Europeans or to trade with Europeans. But there's another point that needs to be made, is that there is mass enslavement that is going on in Africa at various times, in various places, that has nothing to do with the presence of Western Europeans on the coast. Now, if they were looking for slaves, they may have benefited it, right? But take, for example, West Central Africa. There was an historic rivalry between the Kingdom of Ndongo and the Kingdom of Congo, right? And the Portuguese, at one time, had great difficulties in making penetrations in Angola against the kingdom. The Portuguese suffered at one point a massive military defeat at the hands of the Kingdom of Ndongo. All right. So as often was the case, and Europeans were very good at this, is they played divide and rule. They made allies. You can't think of, for example, I say this all the time, Cortez had tens of thousands of Indian allies. He could not have conquered Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital city. In Africa, the Western Europeans benefited by playing one ethnic group against the other. Understand, African is a word we imposed. It obfuscates a very complex reality. There are different ethnic groups, they're stateless societies, their kingdoms, their empire. Is enormously complex history. And to be honest with you, there's much more we need to learn. I know there was a project, I think it was at least started at Harvard, where we're attempting to translate all sorts of Arabic sources, which would illuminate the enslavement process in Africa. Now, were there certain places that did not enslave? very few off the top of my head that I can think of that were of importance. And even understand, even if they did not, and this was the purpose of my contact, even if they did not enslave, that did not mean they did not have within their societies extreme forms of dependency. So when you think of slavery, you got to put it on a continuum. This was my point about the metaphor of bundle and property rights. All right. You know, it's oftentimes tough to make an analytical distinction. How do you distinguish between serfs and slaves? Well, there's some people, if you look at Eastern European serfs, they could be bought and sold. It's virtually indistinguishable from slavery, you see. But all those forms of servitude imply an extreme dominion. And when we look at them, we have to look, okay, in this dominion, what is the particular bundle of property rights that one holds over another? And that's how we try to draw these analytical distinctions. But in responding, you know, this utopian idea that everyone live free and equal, you know, sorry, I don't see many of those places in antiquity moving forward. Nor do I think that such utopian dreams are possible. I am not a utopian.
Thank you. I have a clarification question, which I want to follow up with something of my own. Somebody asking, did you say Brazil imported roughly 4 million slaves and the US imported 400,000, and yet by 1850 there were more than 4 million blacks in the United States, and I believe that's more than in Brazil. I want to sort of follow up on that. What was it about Brazil that made it much more deadly? In fact, was it just climate, or was there something about the slave regime itself that differed?
Yeah, well, I think it's a complex of factors. I think you had larger units exposing slaves to epidemic disease. I think you had lower fertility, you had higher mortality. The nature of the work is different. So there is no one factor that explains this demographic differential that existed between Brazil on the one hand and, let's say, the United States on the other. What we do know is that there was an extraordinarily high fertility rate of slaves in the United States. Robert William Fogel, the Nobel Prize winning economist, in his great book, Without Consent or Contract, has noted that female slaves in the United States had longer childbearing span, and had shorter intervals between births, which contributed to the higher fertility. Another factor, of course, would be the continuation of the Atlantic slave, which distorted the demographic pyramid, distorted sex ratios. I know from my early work on Cuba, there were estates, sugar plantations in Cuba, which had more than 500 slaves, not one of which was a female. Now, it's pretty hard to reproduce naturally that way. So how those populations did grow, if they did, was by continued imports from Africa. And so you're absolutely right. This is one of the great ironies, or better said, the great paradoxes of the history of slavery in the Americas, that the United States, or what became the United States, was a relatively minor importer of African slaves, yet by 1860, probably had a larger population of slaves than did Brazil, which imported almost half of the total of 10 plus million that arrived in the Americas. Okay. And I might add, throw in, is that those two places may not have had the most slaves in the world at that time. There was a caliphate in the Sudan, the Sokoto Caliphate, which may have had more than 4 million slaves in 1860. So again, you rightly point to an important demographic paradox, and it's one that's still being looked at. But interesting enough, even the scholars relied on by the 1619 Project, if you look at their work, like Michael Tadman, who is cited with respect, to sugar and the internal slave trade. Michael Tadman, in a very important essay he wrote in the American Historical Review, underscore this extraordinarily high rate of natural increase enjoyed by slaves. Now, where whites in the US and slaves in the US differed was in infant mortality. That's important. And the best work on that subject has been done by a student of Robert William Fogel, an Ohio State professor named Richard Steckel. And so they had the higher infant mortality, higher child mortality. But about from age 7 on, the life expectancy is pretty close between white and black in the Old South, right? In the cases of Brazil, look, there is no question. My first book, which gives you an idea why Cuba and Brazil may have had a different demographic experience, was entitled Sugar is Made with Blood. And it comes from a saying in Cuba, con sangre se hace azúcar, all right? Sugar is made with blood. And it speaks, to the rigors of sugar cultivation in particular. And a Cuban scholar by the name of Fernando Ortiz said it takes two things, to cultivate sugarcane: brute strength and breathless haste. And wherever you see sugar plantations in America, you will see, because of the brute strength, disproportionate numbers of males. In the US, which helped in reproduction, is you find sex ratios of slaves tending towards equality in most places. Interesting enough, one of the notable exceptions of equality of sex ratios was in the sugar plantation zone in lower Louisiana.
I guess I actually have a follow-up to that. Did any Western Hemisphere slave society have a better demographic result for slaves than the US? And related to that, who was second after the United States?
Yeah, well, look, and this is where the distinction between societies with slaves and slave societies comes in. Notice that I was careful to mention slave societies. There are societies with slave, and I think there's some statistics available. For example, the Bahamas, where we can see a rate of natural increase that is comparable to the United States. So when I make the generalization throughout time, I make it with reference to major slave societies.
Yeah. So, and of those, you'd say the United States has the highest ratio of natural increase.
Yes. Of births over death. And remember this is that, and this is some people might want to know, because this is studied. W.E.B. Du Bois, great thinker, did his dissertation on the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade and posited, because he noticed this rate of natural increase. And so he posited an extraordinary illegal slave trade to the United States after 1808. Well, both qualitative and quantitative evidence does not support it. I mean, one figure that's now actually deemed high by many scholars is that at most 50,000 slaves arrived illegally in the United States between 1810 and 1860. Well, what's the quantitative evidence? Well, because the Atlantic slave trade brought far more males than females. Had there been an extensive contraband slave trade to the United States, it would have showed up in the census data in the sex ratios of slaves. It does not. As I said, we see a kind of a leveling or equalization of those sex ratios. And then, as you might imagine, because of the abolitionist movement, there were all sorts of people heading south trying to find evidence of illegal imports. And there would be distinctive tattooing and scarring patterns that would become immediately visible if there were on illegally imported slaves from Africa, if there had been large numbers. And that qualitative evidence does not exist. Just a bit. There's a few, but not much.
Thank you. I have some questions about critical race theory, and in fact, and its effect on being able to have any debate at all. And I suppose I would broaden that a bit. We presumably started out, having to argue against a certain, political correctness, political skew, back in the 80s, which I think has become worse with the introduction of critical race theory. And I guess, can you comment about how much more difficult has it become to even have these conversations when you're having them with people who now buy into critical race theory, standpoint epistemology, and so forth?
Well, I remember when critical race theory posited people like Derek Bell at Harvard, who was very controversial then, did not get tenure at Harvard, but then went elsewhere. And remember that Derek Bell was very influential on Barack Obama, that critical race theory was seen as quite exotic, marginal, heavily criticized. And what we need to do is, I think, good thinkers, is how do we explain how rapidly critical race theory has taken over certain sectors, not only of the academy, but administrations in corporate boardrooms, etc. Right? Especially since it's indisputable in my view that critical race theory is an ideology. Right? That look, race is important. No one denies it. There's been an avalanche of books written about it. But understand this is that race and racism doesn't explain everything. And to this, I would go back to my definitions. All right. Race is a word with a very long history, but evolving meanings. Race could mean just simply a group, type, kind, or class. Race in the early modern period tended to refer to genealogy, a group of people that had a common ancestor, which is important to know because one of the crucial preconditions of modern racism was so-called purity of the blood concepts in Europe, which are related to genealogy. Now, what's interesting, of course, is the historically specific creation of a modern notion of race, which is a race is a group that defines itself or is defined by others according to certain outward physical characteristics, which are regarded as innate or immutable, and to which moral and intellectual criteria are attached. Now, that's something new under the sun. Why did it come about? And of course, there, I think we have to explore the growth of Enlightenment rationalism, the attempt to categorize human beings, and to apply reason, to the understanding of difference under a certain set of conditions. I might tell you, and this is from my own work, what's interesting is that in many colonies, like I'm thinking of Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti, there were certain areas of Saint-Domingue early on in 1685, first French slave code, allowed marriages between white and black. Okay, 1685. And in Saint-Domingue, particularly in the South Province, you had a very large class of mulatto slaveholders who came about as a result of a time when relations between what we now call races, which were much easier and fluid. Sometimes those relations, organically grown, are very favorable to interactions. It's when the state intervenes and passes certain kinds of legislations that things become worse. And if you look at certain slave codes and what they demanded in Louisiana, which imposed a variant of the 1685 code, in 1724, they abolished that earlier provision, which allowed marriages between white and black. So again, it's complex. And one way I would say is that sometimes, let these things, I've counseled administration, instead of this vast bureaucracy called the diversity cartel, let black and white students talk these things out on their own. Because oftentimes as a result, that organic, getting to know the people who have these views and understanding them better with chats, not with people forcing or imposing views, is a better way to go. I'm a big believer, let's discuss, come into my office. I think I was renowned when I taught at Hamilton College for the amount of time I gave students, whatever they needed. And sometimes when these troublesome topics came up, If they couldn't get the words out in class, let's go in the office, let's deal with it, and we'll bring them back up the next day in class, and we'll talk them out as a class. It is, without question, much more difficult today than ever, to speak honestly, to try to speak with historical knowledge, because the ideology, as I said, of the thing that's so damning about critical race theory is it has built in the thickest insulation that I've ever seen to protect it against criticism. And what's that? Well, you're speaking from a standpoint of white privilege, as if those kinds of assertions aren't racist unto themselves. Because you look at my phenotype and say that I'm white, I have nothing possibly of interest to say. Well, if that's the case, how can anybody who is of African descent speak on any question pertaining to whites? I mean, you're back to those kinds of, back and forth, which I thought we had surmounted decades ago, but again, alas, not so. So look, what we need are good people of all colors to come together, learn more, pontificate less. And one way we do this is through good history, not the 1619 project, which is hardly that.
And this, I think, we're at 12:15 or so, and that's, I think, a wonderful way to end this session. I want to give you some last words. I just want to say to the audience, we will be having our next panel at 2 p.m. That's American Ideals, moderated, excuse me, by Thomas Lindsay, with Kevin R.C. Gutzman, Jason Ross, and Joseph Fornieri speaking. So please, everybody, tune in again in only a few hours. But Professor Paquette, do you have any last words you want to give to the audience?
Well, listen, I want people to be sure to buy Peter Wood's book, forthcoming book, The 1620 Project, because it's outstanding. And you asked for ammunition against critical race theory in the 1619 Project. That provides it in abundance. And Peter has done a very good job in not only analysis, but in writing this up. It's a very good read.
Thank you so much, and thanks on behalf of Peter. Anyway, well, thank you, and I'm going to, I think, close the discussion now. Thank you again so much for taking part.
Okay, glad to be here. Have a good day, everyone.